Within the commercial and clinical division of Unifar Group, we are future-focused, exceeding expectations, and leading the way in the medtech and pharma industry. The commercial and clinical division represent 8 of the world's top 10 manufacturers, connecting world-class portfolios with our expert teams to become a multi-speciality business. Our meticulous implementation strategy delivers service excellence at each step of our integrated value chain. A pioneering multi-channel approach allows us to interpret insights, unifying and unlocking data for meaningful change. Through each life cycle, brand strategies evolve so that we can provide tailored solutions for our clients, setting a new standard in intelligent brand engagement to deliver optimal performance at all stages of the product journey, ensuring return on investment. All of this is delivered by a disruptive digital expertise, enabling a scalable infrastructure across Europe. Supported locally by our highly skilled people, focused channel investment, dedicated support departments, and tailored customer engagement. We're ready for the future. Are you?
It's people and their stories who inspire us to get vaccinated. People like Rosie.
I'm getting vaccinated, so it'll be safe for me to have the physio I need to improve my mobility.
People like Stephen.
I'm getting vaccinated, so I'll be able to get back to volunteering at the sports ground.
People like Sarah.
I'm getting vaccinated so my parents can hug my baby.
Vaccines are among the biggest success stories of modern medicine, saving millions of lives worldwide every year. They mean different things to us all.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Forum. I'm Jonathan McCrae. The Forum is IFA's thought leadership platform for healthcare and medicines innovation, and it's sort of a virtual reimagining of the Innovate for Life IFA annual conference that was a bringing together of people and ideas to explore the industry, the value, and the innovation that's happening. Thanks so much to Unifar, who have sponsored the series and have sponsored IFA events in the past. Your support is very much welcome. Thank you very much for that. If you'd like to comment on anything that's going on, the hashtag for today's IFA Forum, and it is European Immunization Week. And before we started, you saw the IFA Vaccines Confidence campaign. If you come across it in your social media, we will really appreciate your support in sharing it across your channels and following it as well. And while COVID is obviously the virus du jour, so to speak, it is important, I suppose, this week to acknowledge the amazing public health intervention that has been vaccines for many decades. Globally, 3 million lives are saved every year because of vaccines, and they have been instrumental in getting rid of diseases like polio. They're important for reducing cancer. They are helping us to limit epidemics in things like measles, rubella, and flu. And so vaccines have this extraordinary legacy in healthcare. But today we're going to focus on, of course, the COVID vaccines. And this is the third episode of the Forum, where we're going to be looking at the new generation of vaccines, exploring a bit of the science, trying to understand behavior when it comes to vaccines, and also consider the legacy of the pandemic and the world's response to it. And to do this, I'm joined by Dr. Declan O'Callaghan, Medical Director of Pfizer Healthcare Ireland, Gary Finnegan, who's Editor of Vaccines Today, Pete Lunn, Founder and Head of the Behavioral Research Unit at the ESRI, and Ronan Costello, who is a Senior Public Policy Manager at EMEA at Twitter. You're all very welcome, guys. Thanks very much for joining us. We would really like you to get involved from the very get-go, folks. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of those over this session. I know there's lots of interested parties and some fantastic minds here. So if our participants can turn on their cameras, we'll get started. Thanks very much for that. So Declan, perhaps we might start with you. Speaking in advance of this event, one of the things that you really wanted to get across is the amazing achievement that these vaccines are, considering no one really had heard of this vaccine a little over 12 months ago?
Yeah, good afternoon, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here. As a physician working in the pharmaceutical industry, it's been really gratifying to see what can be achieved in such a short period of time. I think if we look back to 14 months ago, when the pandemic was actually first happening, I mean, the level of fear was so huge, it impacted all our lives, and obviously the concept of the potential for vaccines was actually discussed widely at that stage. And I can really recall what the tone of the conversation was. It takes years to develop vaccines. Vaccines take 10 or more years to develop. There was also questions from experts about whether actually the coronavirus was going to be a suitable virus that would actually be amenable to vaccines. And I think it's absolutely remarkable that within a 12-month period that you actually have 4 efficacious vaccines for treating COVID, and the significant impact that they have actually on the pandemic and on the world. And it occurs to me that, and maybe Pete later on might be interested in making a comment on it, it begs the question, if we didn't have a vaccine now, what situation would we be in from a mental health point of view, socioeconomic point of view as well? I think it's been a huge testament to the academics, to the innovative pharmaceutical industry in developing vaccines, and indeed a new vaccine platform, the mRNA platform, which has been a significant development and has shown remarkable efficacy in preventing the disease. And indeed, real-life evidence has shown us that it's actually preventing transmission of the disease to a large degree, which is hugely significant as regards us trying to control the pandemic.
Declan, can I ask you to be 100% frank with us? Obviously, working in an organization where you are working on a vaccine, it's important to sort of to be positive. But in your heart of hearts, did you think that we would be where we are today 12 months ago?
I'm always frank, Jonathan. I think that there was a high level of suspicion that success would actually be difficult. And I think one of the things that actually is very important to realize is that the companies developing these vaccines made a huge attempt to actually expedite the process, and it looked at various different ways of expediting that process. But one of the things that and the CEOs of all major pharma companies involved made a commitment that it would only be done at the speed of science. So there wasn't going to be any shortcuts about the robustness of the science involved in it. And I think that was very important to reassure the public that this wasn't going to be, done quickly, done shoddily, and without, a very significant attention to quality, efficacy, and safety of the products.
And I suppose that communication was so clear because of the legacy of vaccine hesitancy in some countries and some pockets, and the growth of it in recent years. Talk to us a little bit about the science then, Declan. These mRNA vaccines, why are they so efficacious, and what is the mechanism by which they defeat the virus?
Yeah. Well, as you know, this is the first mRNA vaccine, and essentially a number of different scientific, academic, and industrial groups were looking at RNA as a potential its use in therapeutics and indeed in vaccines, and Pfizer had been working with its partner BioNTech, looking at the potential of mRNA viruses, for example, for influenza. And in early February 2020, when the Chinese actually published the genome sequence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, this was actually very important because it gave actually the substrate for the scientists to work on to actually, and essentially what it involved was creation of messenger RNA from the the genome sequence that was actually provided. And this messenger RNA, what essentially it is it's a genetic code, which actually, if you like, is the code that actually produces the plan to create a protein. And for the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the part of the RNA that was used was coding for what's called the spike protein. And we're all well aware of the image of this SARS virus with all the spikes sticking out. But these spike protein is critical to how the virus actually infects people. It actually binds to receptors on the human cells. And then once it's bound to those receptors, it fuses with the cell and infects the cell. So obviously that was a very important target. So by identifying the messenger RNA that could code for that protein, this messenger RNA is then encapsulated in lipid microparticles. And then these are injected. So as distinct from other vaccines in the past where you were actually injecting dead virus, inactivated virus or parts of viruses, in this situation, you were actually injecting the code that would actually create it. So once it's injected, the cells actually read the code and actually create and manufacture the spike protein. The spike protein is then recognized by the body as being a foreign protein, and it stimulates an immune response. And I guess the underlying principle then is once you have sufficient immunity against a spike protein, if you get a spontaneous infection by the virus, that you're prepared to react promptly to it and prevent serious infection.
Yes. So once it's introduced to the body, the immune response and how vaccines typically work, that sort of takes over in the same way. I suppose this is it's an interesting time now because we're at the coalface of this vaccine rollout. There's a bit of optimism. I mean, today we find out that May 10th we're looking at reopening the country. I'd like to go to you, Pete, and maybe talk a little bit about how we got there, and maybe you might talk to us a little bit about your insights in terms of behavior, how people are deciding to vaccinate at the moment, because people may have seen the new IFA survey, which showed, really high confidence levels in Ireland in this vaccine. 85% they'd take it, 10% unsure, but only 6% would actually refuse it. I'm wondering if you might dig deep into the decision-making process there, Pete, to start off with. Why do people decide to take or not take a vaccine?
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Jonathan. There are multiple reasons, all of which have led to a situation where multiple studies, including one of our own as well, are showing that there's a sort of consistent upward trend in willingness to take the vaccine. It was quite steep, actually, between a period shortly before Christmas when news of the effectiveness of the vaccines first broke, and a period of around kind of 2 or 3 months to January, February. There was a really quick increase, and it's leveled off a bit since then, and there's some signs of small dips associated with the stories to do with blood clots, but it remains remarkably high and on this kind of small upward trend. Some of that from a behavioral point of view is really straightforward. It is just familiarity. So despite what Declan said, and he's absolutely right about how quickly the vaccine was produced and that corners were not cut, there was a real worry among a lot of the public about the speed at which the vaccine had been developed, and just a bit of familiarity and a little bit more time and a little bit more getting used to the idea. These are just sort of straightforward psychological impacts that have occurred to many people and have made them move from the don't know into the yes camp. And we've seen that happen steadily over a period of months. So some of it's just familiarity, and some of it is just the fact that the news is generally good and people have longer to make the decision. The interesting thing, though, is that we still have a situation where the number who are in the don't know category and in the know category, and the don't know category is about twice the size of the know category, is still important. There's still a job to be done there. And one of the things we've noticed about that is, despite all of the attention that is focused on misinformation and anti-vaxxers on social media, and that this is the sort of thing to be talking about, actually good old-fashioned media is a lot of the issue here. What we find in our research is that there is a minority of the population that's pretty much switched off from COVID news. They switched off sometime late last year. They're not following it anymore. And many of them have still not absorbed the message about quite how effective these vaccines are. So when we explicitly test their knowledge, and that's what we do, we run behavioral studies where we ask people multiple choice questions and see if they can get the answers right. people simply don't know how effective some of these vaccines are yet. And when I say people, I'm just talking about this minority that are in the know and the don't know camp. And what we find in our studies is this group are typically quite cut off from mainstream media and haven't absorbed the basic message about how effective these vaccines are. So they're people we really need to reach with traditional media. It's not about fighting misinformation, important though that is. It is just about getting people to understand how effective these vaccines are as a weapon.
It seems to me that, certainly being in the traditional media, we have been banging on and on about this, but what makes you think that the traditional media are not getting that message across?
Well, the problem actually is that nobody.
I'm not taking this personally, by the way.
Right, you obviously have a fantastic audience, Jonathan, but these people are not listening to you.
Yeah.
They've switched off from COVID news. So anyone who works in sort of standard communications knows that what that means is you've got to go for a much broader campaign. You've got to use the networks that are in the health service to reach people. You've got to use your GPs very strongly to reach people. So, sorry, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to blame the mainstream media.
And I'm not taking it personally, but I was wondering.
It's not a failure of the mainstream media. What you've got to then use is other systems to get that message out to those people.
In terms of this acting or not acting, I don't know if you heard this hugely influential podcaster in America, Joe Rogan, had this comment where he said, if you're young, I would say don't get the vaccine. And I've spoke to Mark Little, who works with lots of different companies working on this idea of disinformation. He was saying those sort of people can have a devastating effect on uptake when it comes to vaccines. If someone is hugely influential and they say, "Oh, we're going to do this or that," are we communicating the implications of not getting vaccinated well enough?
So a couple of things there. I mean, one is we actually see, yes, there are age differences in willingness to take the vaccine, but they're not as strong as you might think. I mean, as it stands, it remains the case the overwhelming majority of young adults want to take this vaccine too, as soon as it's offered to them, right? So we have had some success in that regard. In terms of misinformation, I mean, the crucial thing is to get information out there in a source that people can use it. I mean, one of the things that's terribly difficult about this is that you're dealing with incredibly low probabilities. And people instinctively struggle with that. All people, smart people, trained scientists struggle with that. If I get you to take a decision that involves assessing a risk of 3 in 1,000, and I compare that with your ability to take a judgment based on, or a decision based on a risk of 3 in 1,000,000, right? Your brain does not code the difference between 3 in 1,000 and 3 in 1,000,000, even though there are 3 orders of magnitude difference between the risk. As far as your brain is concerned, it's just, oh, it's a small risk, but it could happen. Right? And that's how coarse the coding in our brains is when we come to making decisions, however smart you are. Now, what that means is you've got to try and get those risks packaged in a way that becomes more persuasive and influential. And I think wherever we put the relative risk from the disease up against the risks of the vaccine, that's a very effective way of doing that, where we can get that relative risk into a number. Now, of course, there are transparency issues there. There's the what research is it based on? There's the, are you talking about the risk conditional on me having caught the disease, or are you including the risk of getting it? There's all sorts of transparency issues, and it's important to be straight with people there. But trying to condense the argument into one that people can actually process and make sense in terms of the relative risk is really important. And the final thing to say is you're absolutely right. There is a standard bias in behavioral science, which is called, because we always name things in ways that make them harder to understand, it's called a mission-commission bias. And what it essentially means is that people get blamed more for negative consequences when they act than if they don't act, but cause exactly the same negative consequences. And of course, in the case of the vaccine, we are asking people to act. Now, what that means is that how we frame the decision is important. If people have to make or if we push people to make an active choice, so not taking the vaccine is itself an active choice, right? That reduces that degree of bias. And that's an important thing about how we communicate here. So, for example, there's a really lovely study in the United States. In fact, there's more than one that shows that if people are told that, look, there is a dose that we've put aside for you, and it's for you, and it's arranged for this time. So it's like an active decision to give up your dose. People are actually then more likely to take it. And you might think that's a crazy way to take a decision that's an important decision about balancing health risks, but that's just the way our brains are wired. So how we frame the decision and getting people to make a really active choice is going to be important too.
That sort of behavioral nudge is at the heart of what we've been thinking about when it comes to communicating behavior over the past year, right?
Yes, but I want to distinguish two things. In behavioral science, we talk about nudges, which are when we frame a decision, we put a context in place, or in the jargon, the choice architecture. And that's an example I've just given you there of trying to frame something as an active choice. That's the choice architecture. But what we also need to give people is what behavioral scientists call boosts, which is really good, digestible ways of understanding real information that change your decision, that are not nudges, that are not about the context the decision is made in, but are actually about your state of knowledge and your ability to weigh things up and make a decision. And that's where that relative risk comes in, and how we get the condensed form of the decision in front of people so they can make it accurately based on the evidence.
Gary, when you started in this world, it was off the back of the H1N1 virus, right? Which is 10 years ago. It's amazing to think it's so long. The difference we see both to the global reaction, the way we communicate it is quite remarkable. Maybe you might tell us a little bit about your work at Vaccines Today and how it's changed over the past while.
Yeah, well, that's right. So after the last pandemic, although it barely felt like one compared to this one, most of the sort of postmortems, for want of a better term, on how that was handled, said that there was a lack of pro-vaccine voices on social channels and in the media. But social channels in particular, because they're so cheap, and even if they're not the biggest part of how people make decisions, a small number of people anti-vaccine can have quite an outsized impact. Vaccine hesitancy is a spectrum. Most people vaccinate all the time, on time. Some people are swing voters or fence sitters, as they call them. But those sort of harder edged anti-vaccine groups can really influence those vaccine hesitant with quite a low budget and just by being well networked. So in the absence of, doctors, industry, experts, just ordinary people coming up to say, I got vaccinated, the vacuum was filled by anti-vaccine voices. And so that sort of prompted the likes of Vaccines Today, but also loads of others, especially in the last 3 or 4 years. You see more health professionals, scientific societies, companies joining in the conversation and being way more willing than they were even 3 or 4 years ago. And that, I think, is a little bit of resilience that's built into the system that has stood us in better stead than that this had happened 5 years ago. So I think things have improved in that sense. However, the nature of a pandemic and all the uncertainty that has come with it makes people more susceptible to easy answers, including false answers. Some spread maliciously, some spread, with the best of intentions on Twitter and Facebook and elsewhere, but even on WhatsApp. Like lots of us have probably seen forwarded many times at the top of a WhatsApp message from family members sharing all manner of questionable information. So while I think we're a bit better prepared, the nature of a pandemic has been a breeding ground for false information as people reach around looking for an answer. And also there has been, I suppose, a kind of an overlap between anti-vaccine conspiracy theories with other communities like anti-5G activists or people who are just put out about lockdowns and or masks or some other liberty related issue. So these groups have kind of coalesced and, as I say, are still having a bit of an outsized impact, but at least we're there this time, which I think helps a lot.
Yeah, I think when it comes to communicating this, there's always this concern about who's communicating. And I'm wondering, do you see, I mean, I've heard on the grapevine, companies are involved in vaccines not wanting to take part in the conversations because actually they only make it worse because they're accused of, trying to make money out of those sort of conversations. Is it important who is talking about these vaccines when it comes to getting people on board?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the messenger always matters. So you've got health professionals are more influential, more credible. And for Vaccines Today, so we are transparently supported by Vaccines Europe, which is the manufacturers' trade association. But we are, and so people will realize this, and some people will discount some of what we say, and that's fine. But generally, the tone of what we're doing, there's no products involved. I think this, is enough for some people, and for others, the fact that we're in a WHO network called the Vaccine Safety Net, which is 95 websites around the world. These sort of external endorsements maybe add a bit of credibility, but for some people it's never enough. So there has to be a diverse number of voices. There was a vaccine coalition for the HPV vaccine, which was really successful in turning the tide there. And that had must have been almost 40 members. And there was something for everyone in this, right? The GPs were in it, but so were the teachers, so were, the Women's Council. There were a lot of trusted voices. So you don't have to trust everyone in the coalition. You just have to trust enough people to think, well, if the Cancer Society think I should do this, maybe I should. And maybe they're going to be important in the next bit, because, as Pete was saying, we are coming into a different, I feel it's a different phase. The first part of convincing older people in February, when cases were high, of a disease that really immediately affected them potentially. I think that's quite different to trying to get someone to show up twice in the summer when they're 29 and cases are very low. They may overestimate the downside and the risk benefit, and maybe don't feel the benefit as strongly. So, and finally, just to go back to what Pete said, old media or traditional media obviously are really influential, and they bleed into each other, new media and old media. But I think we've been vaccinating people who are watching the 9 o'clock news now and reading the Irish Times. But as we go on, I think social media still is a small part of it, but a growing part of it as we go down the age groups.
No, absolutely. Speaking of social media, Ronan, people may notice if they're on Twitter, on the top of their timelines, that there is some new messaging for European Immunisation Week. Maybe you might tell us a little bit about that, and then we might talk a little bit about misinformation. By the way, if you are getting your questions into us at the bottom of the screen, please keep them coming. I'm going to get to them. Just want to hear from Ronan first. So Ronan, tell us about this new campaign at the top of people's timelines.
Yeah, so this kicked off at the start of the week to coincide with European Immunisation Week, but also globally World Immunisation Week. So it's live in several countries, in several different languages. Folks will have seen it here in Ireland. It's a continuation from an Irish perspective of this great partnership that we've had with the HSE, which predates even the COVID pandemic. We first set up a vaccination search prompt, and indeed an anti-vax search prompt, in around October 2019, such that if you typed in keywords in the Twitter search bar to do with vaccinations or anti-vax terms, the first thing you'd see was a box at the top prompting you first, before you look at the tweets below, to go to the HSE's website or to go to the HSE Twitter account for the most authoritative information around this. And so this timeline prompt this week, which if you're on Twitter, you'll probably have seen, is bright, big, colorful, again, prompting you to go to a dedicated page on the HSE website that's specific to the COVID-19 vaccine. That is in itself, I guess, a nudge. You were talking about that earlier with Pete, that I think the product team in Twitter, and I'm sure across other platforms, have been focusing on how do you nudge people towards decisions that's based on authoritative, credible information. The timeline prompt is one example of that. The search prompt that we launched in 2019 is an example of that. That was then expanded in March or April of last year, I think March last year, with the HSE, to include authoritative information about the COVID-19 virus. And then it was expanded again earlier this year, once Ireland and the EMEA had approved certain vaccines. So now if you type COVID-19 vaccine or something along those lines, we work with the HSE on a list of keywords, you'll see at the top of your search list a link to the HSE website. And I think that's kind of, this is a strategy that we've been pursuing in a lot of different areas. We have a misleading information policy, which includes COVID-19. That was the latest sort of policy area that was added, but it also includes elections. It also includes deep fakes, synthetic and manipulated media. And the product team has been experimenting with things like, for example, labeling content that includes what they would determine as harmful, misleading information, false information that could lead people to make decisions that harm themselves or others, such as ingesting an unproven cure or treatment for COVID-19. And in labeling content, and by making those labels interactive such that they bring you to more authoritative sites, etc., I think, again, we're wading into that territory of trying to nudge folks in the right direction.
I mean, is that more effective than censoring and blocking those sort of accounts? If you can identify that this is misinformation, can you not also stop that misinformation rather than labeling it and allowing people to read it?
Yeah, absolutely. And we do that as well. I think it's important to say that there's a spectrum of harm, and the most harmful and misleading information tweets or accounts that are engaged in a serial abuse of our policies, in spreading misinformation that is outright harmful to individuals or groups of individuals. Those accounts and that content can be bounced from the platform. And indeed, since the introduction of the COVID-19 misinformation policy last year, we have challenged upwards of 11.5 million accounts globally for engaging in that kind of behavior. And those challenges, where we're asking someone to prove, for example, that a real person is behind the account and that it's not an automated, inauthentic effort to manipulate the conversation, those challenges are often not met, right? And so the account then is automatically suspended. That's always going to be part of how we moderate the platform, because in those instances, where we're looking at potentially coordinated efforts to manipulate the conversation around a particular issue, be it COVID-19 or elections or whatever it might be, there is no benefit to keeping those accounts on the platform, right? Because they are almost single purpose accounts that just need to be removed.
Right. Do you think social media companies are doing enough? Because if I think about the misinformation that is out there, we're very lucky in Ireland that we do have a pretty good traditional press. I think, that at least in terms of highly partisan content, you don't see an enormous amount of it, and the information that most of these outlets are trying to get out is usually helpful. Most, or if not all, of the misinformation, disinformation is happening on social media. Are social media sites doing enough?
Well, I can only speak for Twitter on that front, obviously. I think Twitter has done a lot, as I said, from the policy front, from recognizing that COVID-19 needed to be added to the misleading information policy pretty early on. We started establishing these partnerships with the WHO, with the HSE here at a national level, with the MEA at a regional, or EMEA at a regional level. We started establishing those partnerships to specifically tackle COVID-19 before it was declared a pandemic. And that actually brings me to a point that where I saw the benefit of Twitter just as a user on a personal level. We had a company gathering last January in the States, and shortly after that gathering in January, we started hearing from colleagues that offices were beginning to shut down. We started, if you followed the right accounts on Twitter, if you followed informative accounts, journalists, if you followed clinicians, if you started following immunologists from across the world, you could see this wave coming towards Europe, literally. And it was coming on Twitter in an informational sense as much as it was in a physical sense in the real world. So I think from that point of view, if you were, again, using Twitter at its best, to its best effect, you were almost sort of able to prepare practically and psychologically a couple of weeks ahead of folks who weren't using something like Twitter.
Certainly, Twitter is my go-to to find out what's happening right now. Getting to some of your questions now, because there are many coming in. Jeremiah, I'll get to your question about vaccines and pregnancy in a bit, but Declan, a question here: what is the application of mRNA technology in vaccines development as opposed to vaccines? Is it being used beyond vaccines, this mRNA technology?
I believe there's been a lot of research looking at its applicability in areas like oncology, and that's one of the particular areas that's been used, but it seems to be exquisitely placed from a vaccine perspective.
Okay. Another says, what is the role of intellectual property in developing the Pfizer vaccine? This is a very timely comment as we're talking about supply and price. how important was IP in the Pfizer story?
I mean, I guess IP to some degree facilitated a lot of very early collaboration with other suppliers, other manufacturers, because there's been an inordinate amount of collaboration across the industry in an effort to increase manufacturing capacity. And I think that was facilitated by IP. The whole question about IP and the question about IP waivers, I think it's not clear at all that that actually would have a significant impact on supply, in that there's a misapprehension that you can take a pharmaceutical manufacturing plant and turn it into a vaccine manufacturing plant in a short period of time, not understanding the complexity that's involved, the requirement for experience and know-how. And it's not just the plant, it's actually the supply chain that supports it. I mean, for example, with the Pfizer vaccine, there's some 280 ingredients involved in it, coming from 85 different suppliers in 19 different countries. So the importance of getting a complex supply chain like that in order to manufacture is very important. What's interesting from a capacity point of view to know is that the annual vaccine capacity worldwide pre-COVID was about 5 billion doses per year. And that was to deal with all the life-threatening diseases that we're aware of. And there's still that requirement. These diseases haven't gone away. But it's estimated that in 2021, 10 billion doses of COVID vaccine will be manufactured. So you can see that manufacturing capacity has expanded exponentially, and certainly is going to meet some of the needs.
There is a sort of a viewpoint that both politicians and some NGOs have aired about this idea that there is lots of supply available, but it's being suppressed to keep prices and keep control on the market. And just like to hear from you on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any evidence from that perspective. I mean, I think that the pricing of vaccines differs. I mean, from a Pfizer perspective, the concept of pricing was that there was a tiered pricing system whereby in wealthy countries it was the cost of a meal, in mid-range countries it was half of that, and it was a not-for-profit basis in poorer countries. And indeed, the manufacturers have come to significant arrangements with the COVAX collaboration to ensure supply to poorer countries, and I think that's a very positive development.
And finally, probably one more to you. How quickly can the mRNA vaccines be tweaked to combat the variants of the COVID virus as it mutates? mRNA vaccines are, I suppose, more manipulatable, if that's a word, than traditional vaccines. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most significant potentials about the mRNA vaccines, in that, if there's a requirement and it's shown that there's a significant variation variant that requires manipulation, the actual change in vaccine can be done relatively quickly. And some people have estimated possibly in 100 days. But what's also going to be required is an agreed regulatory approach to that, so that there's no point in creating a vaccine in 100 days if you've got to do months and months of large-scale clinical trials. So there will have to be some sort of mutual understanding about what surrogates of protection you could have, levels of neutralizing antibody that the vaccine produces, so you can expedite actually manufacturing and delivery of revised vaccines.
Pete, I was really interested to hear about the sort of bounce-on effect of things like Golfgate, the Beacon story, that stories in the press, much more than data, have a big effect on people's behavior. If we see bad behavior, then we end up behaving badly as a result of that. I'm wondering, is that likely to happen when it comes to vaccine rollout? Do you think the lax behavior that people go out and mingle when they probably shouldn't after something like Golfgate, are we likely to see something like that when it comes to vaccine take-up?
In all honesty, I don't think so. I mean, you are right. The evidence suggests that, and the Irish evidence is pretty plain, that Golfgate had an impact on compliance with public health restrictions. It didn't last that long. It was a few weeks, but I mean, it was there and we could see it in our data. So no question about it. I think what's different though is there you're in a collective action problem where people are making sacrifices for the common good. I don't think most people anyway, are viewing taking the vaccine as making a sacrifice for the common good. There's a common good element to taking the vaccine. Of course there is. I mean, you can make the argument that it's a responsible thing to do from a wider societal perspective, but you've also got a very strong personal incentive to take it too. So I wouldn't anticipate that negative stories about how the vaccine is being allocated, or shall we say certain institutions getting up to no good with that allocation, I wouldn't see them having a negative impact on people's willingness to take the vaccine, no.
The storytelling has been a major part of this, right? In terms of how we see the public responding. You gave the example in another talk about the Waterford couple and the effect of this one story might have on the entire nation, and how that ended up trickling down to behavior. I want you to talk a little bit about that, and then we might talk about how we might use story in the promotion of vaccines.
Yeah, it's a great point. And again, it's a regularity in behavioral science. I mean, there are now multiple studies that show that you can put scientific data in front of people, even simplified and tested with focus groups or whatever, to try and get it as easy to understand as possible. And it turns out to be less persuasive than a simple narrative story that might be conveying less information, but gets a central point across in a narrative way. Truth of the matter is, our brains are programmed to understand plots and stories and cause and effect and narratives, and to find them very persuasive. And there's nothing we can do about that. That's just what the psychology shows. Some of us are really good at absorbing scientific data, absorbing probabilities and making judgments and trade-offs there and coming up with the right answer. For most people, that's not so effective. So yeah, it is true that communication that is based on narrative and storytelling, people are more likely to remember it, they find it more influential, and they find it easier to comprehend in the first place. So the trick is to get good science into narrative accounts. Right? And if we can get good science into narrative accounts, then we're scoring, because we're using not only the science, but we're using the behavioral science for the science communication to make it better. And again, of course, you always face trade-offs with being faithful to the science, making sure that you are being objective and you're getting it right. But I actually find in my work that an awful lot of the time you can find example stories that get across the fundamental scientific findings that you're producing in more complex ways, using statistical analysis.
In terms of vaccine, we haven't seen an enormous amount of, I suppose we've seen sort of people going to get their vaccines. Are there other ways we could use story to help that vaccine rollout?
Yes, I think there are. I mean, I think personal stories about how taking the vaccine has changed people and what their experience of it was are good things to tell. I mean, we'll all start doing it with each other. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I mean, I'm doing it with my family already. I mean, various members of my family have had a jab. I mean, all they want to do is talk about what their experience of it was, what it was like to psychologically go through it, how they're changing their decision-making as a result of it, what they're expecting to, all of that is good stuff. I'm partly going right back to the point I made at the start. It's about familiarity. I mean, it's about people being comfortable that this is part of life now, and this is a set of decisions you've got to absorb, and you can't just hide away from it and pretend it's not happening. And one of the interesting things in our data is it really does look like there's a section of the population, it's not very large, but it's there, who are essentially just doing that. They're just going, please go away, I hate this. Right? And we have to communicate with those people, and we have to be sympathetic to that. We can't just simply write them off as conspiracy theorists or anti-scientific people. We need to be sympathetic to how distressing some of this is for people, because an awful lot of that information avoidance, and again, there's behavioral science here that will tell you there are good reasons why people are information avoidant. A lot of that information avoidance is based on emotional situations that people find themselves in. They do find processing this information very difficult. They find it extremely stressful. So we do have to be sympathetic to a lot of these people as well if we want to persuade them to get on board.
Yeah, and I think that it's very dangerous to sort of vilify people who take that viewpoint, because I worked in youth radio, and all the assumptions I had about everything were challenged weekly about why someone would act in a certain way. And it really, I mean, it made me a hardcore lefty in one respect, but it also gave me that insight that people have these opinions for good reasons to them, and if you were in their shoes, you probably would have those opinions again. And the idea sometimes that how could these people be so stupid, or how could they not believe in vaccines? How they have lived their lives, the things they've been exposed to, those stimuli are the reasons why they feel that way. And I suppose empathizing and trying to understand that is probably a better way of approaching this. Gary, Why have we not seen vaccines from traditional vaccine platforms, considering the success in other disease areas? Someone answered, and I thought you might be good for that.
Yeah, I suppose some of this goes back to what Declan was saying. Like this time last year, if you talk to a lot of senior people involved in the research side of vaccine development, there wasn't huge optimism. And then the summertime, the FDA and the US were saying they'd take a vaccine or approve one if it was 50% efficacy levels. So, I mean, we use the hashtag vaccines work, and I was worrying about having to retire that hashtag if we were at 52%, you know, and trying to convince someone in a sort of a risk benefit equation in their own minds to take whatever chance they think they're taking. And at half the time it won't work would have been quite difficult. So in a way, some of those predictions were true. The traditional ones have been taking longer. There's some big players who've done an awful lot in vaccines that haven't yet delivered anything. So we're kind of fortunate that loads of early work was done on mRNA vaccines.
Because
go on.
I mean, if you imagine what it would be like trying to get people to sign up to a vaccine that was 50% or 40% efficacious, you can imagine that being a much bigger struggle.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the gifts, I suppose, that we've had in the first quarter, that, you know, in addition to having very high levels of efficacy, like they almost always keep you out of hospital, which is kind of what we always wanted all along, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that helps in the convincing people. And some of the other things that just mentioned what you said to Pete about some of the bad behaviors. I think when you're talking about lockdowns, it is different to vaccines. So when you saw bad behavior on Golfgate, it was annoying to us because we've been so good. But when you see queue skipping at the Beacon, there's a sense of injustice, but it actually tells you that vaccines are an object of desire. And it's like, you know, people are jostling to be in group 4 or group 7. But that all feeds into this thing that, oh, I think I want this thing that everyone wants. It works with anything you're trying to convince people of. So I think that helps a lot. And then also the storytelling, as you mentioned, does help with confidence. Like the 3 C's of vaccine hesitancy are confidence, complacency, and convenience. So the confidence is more about, you know, how people perceive the risk. The complacency may come if cases drop, but I think convenience has been underestimated a lot. You know, there's a WHO guide called TIP, which is Tailoring Immunization Programs, and they've sort of gone in to specific sub-communities where, say, measles vaccine uptake was low, and try to look at what the barriers are and take them away. So it's not always what you guess. You know, they went into Orthodox communities in London where rates were really low, and they thought, well, maybe, you know, they didn't know anything about them, but thought maybe it's because there's a perception that there's gelatin products in it and it's not kosher or something. So they asked them, radical move, what is it that's stopping you from doing it? And most of them weren't anti-vaccine at all. The average number of kids in the family was 7. Most of the mothers weren't driving and they were responsible for all the appointments, and they were getting on a bus or walking across London, and it's just too many appointments.
Yeah.
You know, so some of the convenience things are really important. So I think, you know, making it easy, a recommendation from your GP, and one final one, it's great to see, it was great to see GPs reaching out to over 70s, but now for the 60 plus and the 50 plus, 40 plus, they have to take the step of logging on to the portal and the 2 steps of showing up twice, even if the first one made you feel a bit ropey. So I think we're sort of, the minimum number of barriers and steps we can put in people's way, the better.
Declan, I saw you nodding along there.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that, you know, all these different things have to be taken into consideration as regards encouraging people. I'd be interested to hear what Pete might think about it. Last night I was looking at a US TV coverage, and I believe one of the southern US states is planning to offer a financial reward to encourage people to take up the COVID vaccine. I wonder what your thoughts of that would be, Pete.
Wow.
Yeah, I think it's a bad idea, because there's good evidence to suggest that if you give people extrinsic motivations, it can crowd out intrinsic motivations. And I think there's powerful intrinsic motivation to take the vaccine. However, the point about convenience is really important. The point Gary's making there, I mean, there's buckets of studies that show it in multiple areas of life, including vaccines, including the flu vaccine and other vaccines, where the more simple and convenient you make it for people to do it, the more likely they are. And you might think, well, hang on, that shouldn't be a part of the decision. And it's actually some quite subtle psychology, because by making things really easy and convenient, you're sending out really strong social signals, as well as reducing just a straightforward barrier. And the social signal you're sending is, this is a really good thing to do. You're sending out really strong advice to do it. And you're also sending out a signal saying, this is what everyone else is doing. Look how easy we've made it. There must be millions of people who are doing this as well. So all of that kind of wanting to feel like, oh, I need the reassurance that others are doing this too, and I need the reassurance that everyone thinks this is a good idea. All of that convenient stuff gives those social signals, as well as meaning that you don't have to attend 7 appointments if someone's made it easier for you and so on. So it isn't just the material fact of convenience, it's the social signal that it sends. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest it's quite powerful.
Someone is asking, could we get a really strong messaging at the end of the vaccine program saying, if you don't take the vaccine, stay at home? How do you feel about that sort of, close to dictatorial, sort of mandatory attitude to communicating vaccines?
You need to be really, really careful with stuff like that. Even in collective action problems where there's a strong social goal that everyone's identified with, if punishments are in any way seen to be disproportionate, or to pick on people, so there may be people who for legitimate reasons and so on, anything like that can actually backfire. It can result, it can have a situation, so however much we might feel there's some justice involved in it, if people aren't willing to take the step, and maybe there is, and that's a decision people can make. The problem is you undermine the collective solidarity of trying to get there by putting something in that some people view as disproportionate. So the kind of overall coordination, the credibility of it, if you like, gets undermined. So, throughout this whole pandemic, actually, we've seen that. There have been some countries where they've come the real heavy on compliance, and actually they've not ended up with better compliance as a result in many cases. In fact, it's often backfired on them, and they've ended up with nasty protests and less compliance. So you really do have to be careful. Punishment is important, but the best punishment we have in society is actually conversation and social disapproval from friends and family. That's far and away the most likely thing to influence our behavior.
Loads of questions coming in. I want to briefly just talk a little bit about the legacy before we get to those. So quick enough, guys, if you can. Declan, what do you think the legacy is of the COVID pandemic when it comes to our healthcare industry and the production of vaccines and our general readiness for something like this again?
I think the pandemic has certainly, highlighted the deficiencies that there is in public health resources. Obviously the laboratory ones, the materials, and I think one of the ones that's becoming apparent now is the lack of unique patient identifiers. As you can see, there's a problem with identifying patients at high risk, and I think that certainly, is an identification. At this point in time, it's actually critical. I think from a COVID perspective, I think what's going to be critical is ongoing sequence surveillance, so that you're identifying if there's any variants present and if they're causing more disease, if they're actually reducing the impacts of vaccines, etc. That's going to be critical.
Do you think we'll be caught out like this again?
I think unless we've actually done a debrief after it and learned the lessons, and I think one of the risks is the further you get away from the horrors of the pandemic, the less impactful those steps are taken on board, because obviously the significance of them becomes less with time.
Gary, what do you think the legacy of COVID is?
I suppose from a vaccines point of view, I'm kind of hoping that some of the legacy is that it'll increase the appetite for life course immunization, as we call it, because there's people thinking about vaccines for the first time in decades that have never thought about it because they're not kids and they're not old enough to be in a high risk flu group. So I hope that their attitudes change, and also some of the things Declan mentioned on legacy on IT systems, vaccinators. We have a lot of trained people to vaccinate now, and lists of vulnerable patients, because a lot of the same people who are at elevated risk of COVID are also at high risk for flu and pneumococcal disease and other things. So life course immunization, I suppose, is my optimistic hope for legacy.
And those, I hadn't thought about that. There are definitely positives that have come out of this horrible mess. Ronan?
Yeah, I think from a Twitter point of view and probably a social media, internet point of view in general, I think it has expanded and accelerated an approach to harmful and misleading information, which was already sort of growing, right? It previously had been focused around elections, big events like that, maybe again, manipulated synthetic media, but now the misleading information policies are expanding, and the ways that we approach those problems are developing and becoming more nuanced, with labeling, as you said, taking accounts off the platform entirely. I think there's also a legacy issue there with respect to the expectations that are justifiably put on social media companies like Twitter. For example, if you're a Department of Health or a HSE in a particular country, you expect social media companies now to be your partners in a all of society effort, right? The tech companies are as much a part of the public health communications campaign as any others. Not that we're doing the communications directly ourselves, but that we are facilitating it, we are amplifying it, we are verifying the accounts of the CMO, the deputy CMO. We're giving prominence to videos from Mike Ryan from the WHO. We're launching emojis about washing your hands, about staying at home, about getting vaccinated. And we're putting prompts in your timeline saying, if you want the latest information on this, go to the HSE. So there's a lot there about amplifying the credible information, giving prominence to the most credible storytellers, to something you were talking about earlier, and generally being seen as a public health partner.
Pete.
Yeah, so we have an expression for them in my house. We call them corona bounces. Positive things that have come out of the coronavirus. And actually, I think there's loads of them. But I do want to caution that we've got a long way to go here. So everyone keeps wanting to talk about the legacy, but we've got a long way to go, and there could be a lot that goes wrong between now and then. But assuming we do come out of this, as we might, I think there's a bucket of corona bounces. One is I think it's forever going to change work-life balance issues. Two is I think it's produced a huge habit breaker, and people have learned an awful lot about themselves during this period from a kind of well-being point of view and how they spend their time, and I think that's good. I think there's a real opportunity for it to renew faith in science and renew smart young people going into science instead of damn financial services. Sorry, did I say that on a recording? I think I did. So yeah, let's get our smart people not gambling with other people's money, but actually trying to solve real problems in the real world. That'd be great. And I think there's also the real potential for a knock-on effect for the really big longer-term issue we face, which is climate change. Because what this does is it proves, if we pull together as a community, what we can actually achieve, what we can change, and what we can do. And I think that gives it some real rhetorical force going forward for solving the big problem of climate change. So yeah, there's quite a lot of corona bounces there, even though there's an awful lot we still have to do.
Great. Okay. I'm looking for fast responses to some of these questions if you can. Thoughts on a vaccine passport as an incentive for vaccine uptake, Pete?
Whoa. Thoughts on that? It has to be fair. It's absolutely got to be fair because it won't have credibility in the system otherwise. I think it's probably unavoidable. That's a judgment call. I'm not totally sure. I think it's probably unavoidable. It probably has to be part of some systems, but it has to be fair, and it has to be something that anyone who is entitled to it can get it and can use, because otherwise it simply won't get the support that it needs to work.
Does it have to be implemented only when everyone has had an opportunity to be immunized?
I don't think so. I don't think so, because I think people will understand that there is fairness goes beyond just sort of straightforward equality of outcomes, and I think people will understand that. But there is a challenge to communicating that, and I am guessing, I don't know. You could easily get a backlash against these passports, so it's really important that communication is good and that fairness is paramount in how it's done.
Indeed, indeed. And we've seen great communication and less than great communication over the past year and a bit from various figures. Declan, speaking of convenience, is pharma creating new methods of delivering a vaccine rather than an injection, which terrifies some people? I might hear from you on that too, Gary.
As regards the vaccine, I think different formulations are being looked at with a view to facilitate, distribution and storage and that. I'm not aware of any developments from a non-needle delivery at this point in time.
Gary, I mean, I know you wrote a little bit on vaccine awareness for the WHO. That when people decide whether or not to take a vaccine, is a needle actually a serious consideration? And are there stories that you've come across in vaccines today that people are using different formulations?
I mean, there are so many. So if you can remove one barrier for people who are, don't like needles, it helps. For COVID vaccines, I haven't heard them yet trying the new forms. But for example, my kids had the nasal flu vaccine at the chemist, and it was painless. And there are other things, people looking at micro needles in patches that are more like sticking plasters and are very easy to put on and slow release. So these things are coming, but it's not for this pandemic, perhaps.
Very good. How well, Gary, this is for you. How well do you think we've done with the rollout versus other countries? It's funny, we can't, no number makes any sense in isolation. You have to have something to compare to, right? So
Yeah.
what is that's how we determine whether or not we've done, is we look across the water. How do you think we've done?
Yeah, I think we tricked ourselves a bit in the first phase in thinking it was brilliant because things were going not so well in the UK, where we consume a lot of their media. If we'd looked at some of the democracies in Asia, they had actually managed it quite well. But on the flip side, I think we're doing far better on vaccine rollout than we think. It's just the UK jumped the gun a little bit or had a head start, but also they had IT systems that Declan mentioned that made it much easier to identify people. So I don't think it's been that bad at all. And even by EU standards, we're usually in and around the middle, if not the upper bunch. So I think we'll look back and it was just something to worry about when we got nothing else to do in spring.
Peter, Declan, do you want to add to that?
I think the point about the relativity of the UK is really, really important. And I think the point about the ability of the NHS to roll out a program like this is designed to do it. I mean, I've been in Ireland 20 years now. I went on holiday and needed a doctor a few years ago. I've been gone from the country for more than 15 years, and my records were immediately called up on the computer by a GP I randomly went to see in Bristol. I mean, we simply do not have those systems, and they do. And because they're the nearest neighbor, of course, we make the comparison. By European standards, as Gary says, we're actually doing really quite well, and we should support this rollout process and keep doing so.
Simone asks, which is the best vaccine? I think I'll answer that one, which is whichever vaccine you get. There's another question about whether or not another lockdown's coming. I'm just not going to even go there for today. Let's have a little bit of optimism on the back of what we've heard this morning. Brilliant speaking with all of you. Thank you so much to our panel, Dr. Declan O'Callaghan, Gary Finnegan, Pete Lunn, and Ronan Costello. Really appreciate your time. Thanks very much. And thank you for paying attention and engaging in those questions. Really appreciate your time. The next discussion is going to be coming up in the next month or so. We will give you communications on that, so watch out for the announcement on that. I was looking for what exactly it's about, but I can't find that right in front of me, so apologies for that. Thanks very much for taking part. We hope to see you again very shortly. And thanks very much to your panel. Good afternoon. Have a great day.